Hi everyone, you're on War and Politics 24. I'm Andrii Drozda, and our guest today is Ciaramella, Senior Fellow and Ukraine Initiative Director on Russia and Eurasia program, the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. Eric, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Andrii.
We will be basically discussing what happened yesterday in the White House in Washington D.C. And my first question would be, how successful were Ukraine, President Zelenskyy, and European leaders in conducting their meeting in the White House? What shifts probably in President Trump's stance could be observed compared to his remarks following the meeting with President Putin?
Well, I think the outcome of this meeting was far better than many of us had feared, given, of course, the track record of meetings between our president and your president going back to the disastrous Oval Office meeting in February. I think President Zelenskyy has done a lot of work to figure out how to appeal to President Trump, how to explain Ukrainian positions in a way that communicates them without, let's say, getting under Trump's skin, which is relatively easy to do because he's a quite emotional person. And so I think President Zelenskyy approached the meeting very calmly. I watched very closely as the two of them were sitting in the Oval Office, and there were a lot of questions being shouted from press. And I think some of them were frankly designed to create a little bit of drama and to have, President Zelenskyy say something that would then make Trump upset, but he didn't take the bait, so to speak. And he remained very, very calm. He gave short answers, very factual, and I think that worked to his benefit. So I would say that from the perspective of tone, symbolism, all of that, the meeting between the two leaders went far better. Then when you look at the European leaders meeting, to me, it was incredible to see the show of support for Ukraine. I mean, to have one leader, let alone 7 European leaders, essentially drop everything and rearrange their schedules within 24, 48 hours to fly across the ocean and come and meet alongside with President Zelenskyy at the White House. I mean, I've never seen that happen before. And the larger meeting where you saw the choreography between the leaders, they managed at the same time to assert their positions and show unity with Ukraine without being confrontational. And so the atmosphere was extremely cooperative and positive. And again, I give a lot of credit to, President Zelenskyy, his team, to the teams of all these European leaders that came for a very excellent diplomatic choreography.
There were a lot of changes here comparing to the previous Trump-Zelenskyy meeting, but in your assessment, how constructive was President Trump in his dialogue with Zelenskyy and with the group of European politicians? His rhetoric, his position, has it shifted?
So that is the big question. And for me, I'm not ready to make any firm judgments because the devil is in the details, and we need to see some of these agreements and policy positions being frankly written down, because Trump says a lot of things. One day it's in one direction, the next day it's in another direction. He's saying something critical of Putin, and then the next day he's praising him, and vice versa with Zelenskyy. So it's very hard to figure out what the U.S. position is. Now, I will say that the conversation shifted from last week, which was about, quote, territorial swaps, and that's language that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, and then President Trump himself have been talking about. And I think that's a very problematic conversation for Ukraine. Number one, because we're not really even talking about a swap, because Russia hasn't agreed to give up any of the territory it controls. And number two, this is a conversation fundamentally about Ukrainian territory, a swap of Ukraine's own territory with itself. So that's very problematic. But what happened yesterday was that the conversation shifted to be about security for Ukraine. And I think that's a very productive and constructive conversation to have. And I hope we can get into a little bit more of the details about security guarantees, because I think maybe it wasn't quite the breakthrough that some European leaders and some in the media have been presenting it as, but it's certainly positive that the subject of conversation now is, how do you stop Russia from doing this again? And I think that is a zone we all want to be in, because that is a zone where we're talking about more defensive assistance to Ukraine, long-term economic assistance, deterrence, building up the Ukrainian army, and all of these things that I think Ukraine should be discussing with its closest partners, rather than this fictional idea of some territorial issue being the kind of be-all and end-all of the negotiation.
Do you think that President Trump has given up at all this idea of swapping, exchanging territories? Because after his meeting with Putin, that was probably the main idea. He was talking pretty often about that.
I don't think he's given it up. I think we'll be hearing more about it. But I think that the European leaders and President Zelenskyy made a very good case that any deal must begin with a clear understanding of how Ukraine is going to be secured in the future. And I mean, I personally hope that he took away from that, that there's no deal without security for Ukraine. I could sort of, again, we're all kind of reading body language, and it's very hard to understand what his true positions are, if he has any true positions, because he is so erratic and, changes his mind all the time. But it did seem like he was being consistent, and he even said it in his social media posts after the meetings that, the topic of conversation was security for Ukraine. And so it did seem to register in a way. But, like you said, I don't think the issue of territory is off the table right now. Number one, because I think Putin is going to be putting it back on the table for whenever they have a trilateral meeting or whatever happens next. And number two, because Trump and Witkoff, they're not foreign policy people. They are real estate developers. And for them, everything is about plots of land. And you just solve, you get this block, I get this block, everyone's happy, and we go make money. And again, that only takes you so far. And in geopolitics, and an issue that's so emotional and fundamental, like the question of Ukraine's sovereignty, for them, it's too abstract to understand. And so I do fear that this idea of territory is really something that they latch onto, because it's the only thing that they kind of understand.
There even was a map of Ukraine with occupied territories in the Oval Office, and many people paid attention to that fact. What was it for, actually? For illustration, for better understanding of situation? Zelenskyy actually showed some details on the front lines to President Trump and to European leaders. So he used that occasion to have a map in the Oval Office.
Yeah, I mean, I think maps are a good thing when talking about any kind of conflict. And I think for Trump, it's the way that he understands what's going on. I thought it was a bit odd that there was kind of the percentages of which oblast was, occupied and so on. I mean, that was a bit strange to me, but whatever it is, I mean, he likes to have visuals and posters, and I think he likes to have some sort of reference point. I mean, I'm curious if that map, which I think was produced by, part of the US government, I think in a non-political way, like an assessment of what the current battle lines look like, if it lines up with Ukrainian thinking, and maybe President Zelenskyy had some points and corrections based on his more, updated information, but at the end of the day, for Trump, understanding the geography of occupied Ukrainian territory, what's going on in the east and the south and so on, I think that is important for him to see visually.
And President Zelenskyy said about security guarantees for Ukraine that will include a strong army, U.S. weaponry deal, and domestic drone productions. And we are talking about some contracts for like $100 billion and so on, like huge sums of money. What do you think about that scenario? Will it work? How constructive this approach could be?
So I think the approach of America selling weapons and Europe paying for them, which was the agreement at the NATO summit, I think actually that is a breakthrough. That I would say strategically is incredibly important in the course of this Trump, presidency 2.0, because before that, I was genuinely worried that Trump would get so frustrated that he would just say, forget about it, no more weapons. And indeed, we had those couple of occasions where the weapons and the intelligence were stopped, although they were quickly resumed thereafter. And I think what NATO, the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, who was there in the White House yesterday as well, what he managed to achieve together with European leaders to create this new paradigm of financing, it's clear that for Trump, he considers that a win, and he's happy with that and proud of it. And he even mentioned it in the bilateral meeting with President Zelenskyy. So I think that is actually a pretty sustainable model, so long as Europe actually can find the money for it, which is maybe a bigger problem because European economies are, let's say, not doing great. I think that raises the question when you put these big price tags on, like $100 billion. I mean, nobody has that right now to pay for American weapons. Is that over the course of 10 years? So on and so forth. Are there different financing mechanisms? Are we talking about the Russian sovereign assets and using some of those, which Europeans have been pretty reluctant to do? I think if you open up that funding stream, then again, we're talking multiple hundreds of billions of dollars or euros that could be used for Ukrainian defense. So I think, it's a little unclear how it's going to be financed. It's nice to try and put a big number on these things. I think to get Trump's attention, $100 billion is something where he kind of, his eyes open and he sees the dollar signs and says, okay, this is good for American business. And that gets his attention. So I think the way Ukraine has packaged it is effective politically. But on a practical sense, we need to find the money for that. Then on the Ukrainian drone production, I think that's more of a medium to long-term perspective. I don't think Ukraine is producing anything now, first of all, that would be exportable because Ukraine needs it for its own defensive purposes at the moment. But secondly, as Ukraine has found, the technology changes so quickly. And so, trying to develop a drone that could be exported to the United States in a few years' time, I mean, the technology might be so different that you can't exactly decide right now what that will be. And so, probably what they're talking about is some sort of framework agreement and sharing of IP and maybe some kind of co-production of certain components, navigation systems, areas where Ukraine has made some sort of innovative leaps. But, for a price tag of 50 billion, that's a lot of production. And so I see that in a much longer term perspective rather than something that could be, implemented within the next year or two.
And then what guarantees for Ukraine modeled on Article 5 of NATO we are talking about here? I think that was Georgia's Melanie idea. She proposed that idea some time ago. And if Ukraine cannot become the member of NATO, what guarantees should be offered here in this kind of model?
This is where I start to, frankly, get a little bit confused. As an expert who studied security guarantees and written a lot about different security models for Ukraine, to me, there's no such thing really as an Article 5 type guarantee that isn't Article 5. So Article 5 is a very specific powerful thing that goes well beyond the text of the North Atlantic Treaty, which is actually rather vague. But it is about all the contingency planning and defense and deterrence posture, U.S. forces that are in Europe, pre-positioned equipment, regular meetings and staff level discussions and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole structure and set of institutions built around Article 5, which is understood to be very simply, if you are attacked, if the territory of any NATO ally is attacked, the United States military will intervene and fight the aggressor. It's very simple. So in this case, we seem to be talking about something else. And, I was really confused by some statements that, Prime Minister Meloni had made several months ago, where she was talking about, Article 5 type guarantees, but not about intervention. Well, that's sort of the essence of Article 5. So, it's sort of like, it's missing the essential element of what constitutes that security guarantee. So, I think this is kind of a sidetracked conversation and a very unhelpful framing, where it's giving Ukrainians the wrong idea about what it is that the partners are actually talking about. So what do I understand is on the table? The Europeans have done a lot of work planning, discussing the modalities of some sort of reassurance force, their actual troops that could go into Ukraine after a ceasefire and play some role, whether it's training or protection of some kind of critical infrastructure or whatever. Again, the mission is pretty unclear to those of us on the outside. I'm sure they've had detailed conversations within governments, but some sort of small reassurance force. But then the fundamental question still remains. So if Russia attacks again, are those French, UK, Swedish, Dutch forces going to shoot back and go to war and involve their own militaries and deploy them to Ukraine to fight the aggression? I don't think that's really part of the conversation right now. So I think we have a real problem here where political leaders are trying to put a label that sounds good onto something where they haven't figured out the fundamental purpose yet. So if it were me and I was designing this, I would think, okay, wipe the slate clean. Let's start from the basics. What is it that Ukraine needs? Number one, weapons. And it needs to be able to produce them domestically and get certain key weapons imported. So the first pillar of any kind of security commitment, guarantee, arrangement, however you call it, is going to be a predictable long-term pipeline of military support. I think that's doable. And I think, the previous US administration under Joe Biden was leading this effort to negotiate these 10-year bilateral security agreements, which were supposed to be the basis of some kind of long-term support to the Ukrainian armed forces. I think those could be developed further. I think they could be legally codified. I mean, in the US case, it would be much stronger of a commitment if it went through Congress, whether the Senate, to ratify a treaty, or Congress as a regular law. And it could really provide the kind of legal underpinnings for continued support of the Ukrainian army. So you have to write that in, and you have to have a real concrete plan for delivery of systems. What is the Ukrainian army going to need in 2, 3, 5 years? What is it going to look like based on the nature of the threat? You coordinate that among all the different parties, and you make sure that Ukraine has a good combination of indigenous production and external support. Then you have the financial element, because you have to keep the Ukrainian government running, and the tax revenues are not enough on their own to sustain that. So you need some sort of economic and macro financial support. You need some kind of provision about sanctions. So if they're going to be pulled back, withdrawn in some sort of peace agreement, you need to have the ability to snap them back if there is another invasion. And that serves as some sort of, element of a deterrent. And then you sort of build from there. And I think still, there could be room for some deployment of European trainers or some sort of small mission in Ukraine. I think there is political will to do something, but I think it needs to be clear that this is not going to be Article 5. I mean, we can't bluff our way through this, because I think in a worst case scenario, we say it's Article 5, Russia tests it, we don't react because we never had any intention of going to war with Russia. And then Article 5 itself for NATO allies becomes endangered. And that's a real concern. You end up eroding your own deterrence and credibility if you make too many commitments and you're not ready to back them up. So unless there's some major change and the US decides that it's in its interest to defend Ukraine, which has been the consistent position of American presidents, that it's not in our interest to actively defend Ukraine, but it is in our interest to support Ukraine's ability to defend itself, very key distinction, then I don't think you get to this real Article 5 type guarantee, which some people have been talking about.
Got it. So looking back at on yesterday's event, to what extent can this collective format of negotiations be considered effective, actually? Why was it important for so many European leaders, politicians, to come to the White House together on that day? And were they, in a sense, shielding, protecting President Zelenskyy from President Trump's demands and his probably aggressive position?
I think it was important, again, to show that it's not just Ukraine having these positions, that fundamentally all of Europe, and these are America's closest allies, and the leaders are people that Trump has dealt with and knows very well, and in many cases trusts and has a good opinion of. It's not just Ukraine, it's Ukraine plus Europe. So this is a bigger issue than, in Trump's mind, just pressuring Zelenskyy to take a deal. And so, I think it was incredibly symbolic and actually, had a practical effect of channeling pressure away from Ukraine to show that this is a much bigger collective problem that America has a stake in as well. So I don't know about this collective format going forward, because I think the key question is, if there is eventually the meeting between President Zelenskyy and Putin with some external participation, I think a trilateral format, in my honest opinion, is not a good one for Ukraine. It's disadvantageous, because I think if you get those three leaders in a room, Trump is going to be very sympathetic to a lot of Russian positions,
he's going to be on Putin's side in that format.
Yeah, it's more nuanced than that. I don't think he will be on Putin's side, entirely, and I do think he wants some sort of just resolution for Ukraine, but because he doesn't understand the details, and Putin is a very persuasive person in these negotiations. He's a very formidable adversary who has been doing this for 25 years and has manipulated so many world leaders. And so you get into the room and you just don't know what, the dynamics are going to be. And although Zelenskyy is a very good communicator and he is able to assert Ukrainian positions, I think in that dynamic, it's going to be working against him. So I think the idea of a trilateral should really be reconsidered. And it should be, and I think actually President Macron said it should be a quadrilateral, which, is probably right. There should be a European voice at the table too, because this is fundamental for European security. Now that poses a problem, because who speaks for Europe? This is the perennial issue. Is it the Secretary General of NATO, who is a European, but also represents an organization that has the United States as part of it? Is it the European Union, which doesn't really have a defense, a hard defense mandate? Is it a particular European leader? Should we be talking about actually the Budapest format, which was the underlying agreement where Russia originally agreed not to violate Ukrainian borders. And so you bring the British prime minister in. Actually, I think that format would work pretty well for Ukraine because Prime Minister Starmer has been extremely consistent in supporting Ukraine, and he's very good at communicating positions to Trump. So I think this needs to be thought through very carefully from the perspective of Ukrainian leadership so that you avoid a trap, falling into a trap where Ukraine is backed into a corner and squeezed between Moscow and Washington. That's the worst possible scenario. And so I really would caution against moving very quickly into this trilateral format.
Now, we are speaking about the chemistry between different politicians and personalities. In your opinion, how significant it was to invite Finnish President Alexander Stubb to Washington? He appears to have established a fairly good rapport, contact with President Trump. Moreover, it was President Stubb who declared yesterday that Kramatorsk cannot be ceded to Russia, as it represents the crucial part of Europe's defensive line and Ukraine's defensive line. That's one question about Alexander Stubb. And why Poland was not there?
Yeah, good questions. So I think President Stubb was brought in part because he established a good rapport with Trump. He's a very good golfer. I mean, you have to really think about the personal dynamics here because Trump is such an unconventional leader and he values very different things than I think a normal American president would. So they played golf together earlier this year and apparently had a good time, and Trump had some respect for him. I think more importantly on the European stage, he represents the so-called eastern flank of the countries bordering Russia. And Finland is unique in that it has a very strong strategic culture about Russia, memory of the Winter War, very strong defense posture, so on and so forth. But it's also a Northern European country, which means that the way that it plays into European conversations is different, frankly, than a country like Poland, where there has been a little bit of tension between Poland and its neighbors and Brussels about rule of law and all these other things. I mean, that doesn't exist with Finland. No one's talking about rule of law in Finland. So, the other European leaders are kind of happy to have Stubb at the table, and he really does represent, I think, the interests of the countries bordering Russia, and I think he's doing it, quite effectively. Why Poland wasn't there is a more complicated story, and in my view, a tragic one, because when Donald Tusk won the election, became the prime minister of Poland, I think everyone hoped that Poland would emerge from its kind of isolation under Kaczynski and Law and Justice and would become more part of the European conversations. And indeed, Poland is, it's rearming quite extensively. Its defense budget is, on track to be as big as some of the big Western European countries. And Poland recently, with all of its economic growth, entered the G20. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. So Poland has potentially a lot of clout, and a lot of people in Europe expected that Tusk would be able to translate that. However, the presidential election, yielded President Nawrocki, who is opposed to much of Tusk's domestic agenda, comes from Law and Justice, and is much more conservative. And there's been a tug of war between them. And, you had this situation last week where President Trump was calling the European leaders to talk about the Anchorage summit with Putin, and Tusk was supposed to attend. And then at the last minute, there was a power struggle in Warsaw, and Nawrocki, booted him out of the meeting. And so there's a real problem of, duopoly of power in Warsaw now, and actually kind of looks in some ways like, some eras of Ukrainian politics where you had real tensions between the president and the prime minister. And this is what happens in a semi-presidential system where it's really not clear who's in charge of these key foreign policy issues. So unfortunately, I think Poland has made itself less relevant in the European conversation by having this internal political struggle. They've been prioritizing their bilateral engagements with Washington, and I think those are going to be happening in September. So, it's possible Poland can emerge from the cold and reintegrate itself into these broader European conversations, but they're going to need to sort out who's in charge of leading that effort and what is the role of the president versus the prime minister. In the meantime, we have Finland representing the interests, like I said, of the eastern flank, and I think that's, a pretty good thing too.
Eric, so you mentioned that trilateral format of negotiations is bad for Ukraine, is disadvantageous for Ukraine, but President Trump announced the meeting between Putin and President Zelenskyy, which intends to hold within the next 2 weeks, pretty quickly. And could Hungary be a possible venue? And then, if not trilateral, if not quadrilateral, then if it's possible at all for Zelenskyy and Putin to meet face to face without any, middleman.
Yeah, I was surprised by this, frankly. I didn't expect that there would be some sort of announcement on a bilateral meeting first. And Trump said it was his idea. And then President Zelenskyy said, if I understood correctly, when he was doing his press, conversation with press after the meetings, he said it was Putin who proposed it. So I'm a bit uncertain as to what was the origin of this idea. The Russian, communication since that announcement has been very cautious. And Yuri Ushakov, the foreign policy advisor to Putin, said, we're prepared to raise the level of the delegation, the level of representation of the delegations. But
Ushakov even said that we are considering about the idea of leveling up this negotiations. So it was pretty blurred and uncertain what they are considering actually about the leaders meeting idea or just leveling up, or what does he mean at all?
Exactly. I don't know what he means. So I think they're trying to keep their options open. And, I'm not sure who wants to meet face to face with the other one less. I mean, Putin hates Zelenskyy, Zelenskyy hates Putin.
Putin always insists that Zelenskyy is not a legal leader of Ukraine, that he's like his term is over and so on. He always repeats that.
Yeah. So it would be kind of it would be, I think, good for Ukraine to be able to assert, again, Zelenskyy is still the legitimate president. You're forced to talk to him because he is our president. And so on and so forth. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know that the sequence of meetings is the right one as it was depicted after yesterday, that there would be a bilateral and then a trilateral. I mean, I think that needs to be really thought through carefully because I think there's a lot of danger as well in a bilateral meeting. As to where it might happen, I mean, I think Hungary would be a terrible venue for Ukraine. I mean, it could happen in Turkey, somewhere in the Gulf. I think the Swiss are sort of open to making some kind of arrangement where they would be able to deal with, the issue of sanctions and the ICC arrest warrant. I mean, part of the issue is Putin has an arrest warrant out for him. And so, he can't formally travel to any member of the International Criminal Court. Now, exceptions can be made and so on and so forth. And I think that's what maybe Swiss are trying to do. I think that would be a fine venue. I mean, genuinely neutral in a European location. But I do think it would be helpful to stage manage a meeting like that to show that Zelenskyy has a lot of other support and it's not just him going into this meeting. So maybe you have another kind of multilateral format right before and afterwards, something like that, to show Putin that it's, a much larger set of countries that are backing Ukraine. I'm not sure, but I do think, Ukraine needs to tread very carefully in getting into this direct dialogue with Putin.
Looking back at last week, how much did President Putin actually manage to secure from the meeting in Alaska? And why was Donald Trump so interested in that meeting with Putin in person? And the third question, was it a good idea at all for Trump to invite Putin to the United States to Alaska?
Yeah, I think that the main thing Putin secured was that the conversation over the summer was quite negative towards Russia. Trump was being very critical of Putin for dragging his feet, for continuing to launch attacks on Ukrainian cities. And what he managed to do, Putin, was kind of diffuse this pressure and flip the ultimatum, which was, 50 days and then 10 days. And again, it became very confusing to all of us who were watching it. But ultimately, he sort of called Trump's bluff about the sanctions. I think Trump never had any interest in imposing additional sanctions on Russia. And he said, okay, why don't we just meet? And then that will be the kind of the outcome of this ultimatum. And Trump, because he likes the performance and the theatrics and all of that, I think decided to call that a victory. I don't think it was wise to have the meeting in Alaska, but it wasn't, fatal either. I mean, it had to happen somewhere. I don't read too much into the symbolism. A lot of people are making comments about, literally rolling out the red carpet and all of that. I mean, I wouldn't have done it if I were, in White House protocol. I think it was a mistake, but it wasn't so disastrous because ultimately, I think for Trump, there wasn't much that he could offer Putin in this meeting to entice him to be more flexible, other than the symbolism and the pageantry of rolling out the red carpet. So from Trump's perspective, giving him the benefit of the doubt, he says, well, what cost is it to me other than some negative media coverage of giving this really nice treatment to Putin, and then hopefully he will be more amenable to doing a deal. I don't think that's how Putin's mind operates, but was it extremely costly to, U.S. interests? I don't think so. I think ultimately nothing really happened from the meeting. And because we had the meetings yesterday with Ukraine and Europe at the White House, whatever progress Putin made in pushing his narratives about territory and the rest of Donetsk Oblast and all these other crazy ideas, I think the script was flipped a little bit yesterday. And so now Ukraine is back in the driver's seat, and we'll see how long that lasts. This is not the end of the story. I mean, this is going to go through many more iterations, and it's going to be a roller coaster. And it's, I have an incredible amount of sympathy for Ukrainians who are watching this and trying to understand what's the outcome and what's the direction of this policy here, because, it's your country that's under attack and your country's future that's at stake here. And unfortunately, from, the perspective of an American expert who's watching what's going on down the street in our White House, it's not linear, and it's not clear where this is going to go. And I think it's going to be many more ups and downs and moments of drama and tension and negative comments about Ukraine and all of that make us think, things are going off the rails, and then it gets back on track. And I don't know where it's going to end up. And I'm sorry to be so uncertain about it, but I have to be honest.
Well, actually, no one knows where it ends up. We don't have this crystal ball with predictions of future. Yeah. I think that we need to mention China in this conversation. How critical is China's role in compelling President Putin to halt his actions in Ukraine. Because often you can hear often from different analytics and media personalities that it is China who holds the key to ending the war in Ukraine. How true is this claim, in your opinion?
I think China has been a major enabler of Russian military reconstitution, a major enabler of the war machine in terms of, purchasing Russian oil. But I don't believe that China is actually the critical player, primarily because Chinese leaders are fundamentally unwilling to apply any significant pressure to Russia. And because I think it's dangerous to have China be the critical, point on a fundamental issue of European security. I mean, there have been some discussions about bringing in China as a guarantor of any kind of peace deal. And of course, there was the original Istanbul documents from 2022, which proposed a P5 security guarantee for Ukraine, which obviously would include China. To me, that's not wise, and it doesn't make sense. And Chinese leaders even are not really interested in playing that role. They're happy to mediate and promote, kind of present themselves as this neutral party, which of course they're not neutral, but they're staying on the sidelines. And I think the idea that China is going to swoop in and solve all of this in a way that is advantageous to Ukraine is really, doesn't kind of correspond to the reality of the situation here.
Eric, thank you so much for this conversation, and I would like to see you once again on our channel pretty soon after probably the next important event would happen. So thank you so much once more, and to our viewers, to our audience, I would like to invite you to subscribe to our channel to know more and to understand the situation in Ukraine and in the world better. So see you next time, and bye-bye. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.